Good morning, and thank you for that warm introduction. I'm delighted and honored to share this virtual space with Lyrasis and to be part of this timely conversation. And as you noted, prompted by tragedy, our nation is embarking on a rare moment of earnest reflection about race and matters related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's a moment that requires each of us to retreat from our respective comfort zones if we are to reconcile our often colliding worldviews. Events of the past year have exposed the degree to which racial disharmony threatens to undermine our democracy. The disparate racial impact of the coronavirus pandemic, the heinous killing of George Floyd, the unending cycle of police killings of often unarmed Black and brown men, and the January 6th Capitol insurrection illuminate ever more clearly the work that lies ahead. So I've been asked to discuss the findings that culminated in my latest book, Diversity, Inc., which explores why, despite the 5 decades-long effort to diversify American institutions and the workplace, people of color remain acutely underrepresented in every influential field. And while based on extensive research, the book is informed by my own experience over the past 3.5 decades working in both daily journalism and in higher education, two realms in which the percentage of African Americans remains disproportionately low. But before I discuss my research, it's important to first define diversity and explore the evolution of its meaning. Our current diversity conversation grows out of the 1960s civil rights movement with President Lyndon Johnson's efforts through his so-called Great Society programs to fold African Americans into the main of American life. Beginning in the 1960s, African Americans were for the first time hired by institutions that had historically excluded them. Of course, over time, the idea of diversity has been expanded to not only encompass racial and ethnic minorities, but also women, people of varying physical and mental capacities, sexual orientation, and other marginalized populations. Indeed, there's little agreement on what diversity means. A survey of some 770 college and university chief diversity officers found that 63% had difficulty even arriving at a common definition, with ideas ranging from simply valuing difference to social justice for those who have been historically excluded and disadvantaged. In 2018, Denise Young Smith, Apple's first ever vice president of inclusion and diversity, took the ever evolving definition to its seemingly logical conclusion when she suggested that 12 blue eyed, blonde, white men could also illustrate diversity due to their different backgrounds. When asked whether she would focus on women and underrepresented minorities, she responded, I focus on everyone. Diversity is the human experience. I get a little frustrated when diversity is tagged to people of color or the LGBT or the women. So the elasticity of the term has rendered it, along with the goals it's intended to accomplish, opaque, and where race is concerned, inconsequential. As diversity has become untethered from the history and legacy of racial injustice, its mission has eclipsed the plight of racial minorities in general and African Americans in particular. Institutions with little racial representation can nonetheless be considered diverse. Overlooked too are the ways in which racial minorities become doubly and triply burdened by interlocking systems of discrimination related to physical and cognitive ability, gender, and sexual orientation. Gains for women, for example, don't necessarily translate into progress for women of color. So, in Diversity Inc., I specifically explore the issue of racial diversity and focus on the three largest racial and ethnic minority groups, namely Hispanics or Latinx, African Americans or Black, and Asian Americans, even as the stark disparity between Blacks and whites remains the most illuminating indicator of America's racial breach. The numbers are telling. While racial and ethnic minorities comprise nearly 40% of the U.S. population, they are just 17% of full-time university professors, which includes faculty at historically Black colleges and universities. Put another way, Hispanics and Blacks, who together encompass roughly 31% of the national population, are just 3% and 4% respectively of full-time professors. Their numbers have barely budged in decades. Meanwhile, non-Hispanic whites, who comprise roughly 60% of the population, hold 83% of full-time professorships. Between 2009 and 2018, the percentage of Black law partners has inched up from 1.7% to 1.8%. People of color comprise 8% of law firm partners. Between 1985 and 2016, the proportion of Black men in management at U.S. companies with 100 or more employees barely inched up from 3% to 3.2%. And between 2004 and 2016, despite a major diversity push at Fortune 500 companies, the racial composition of corporate board seats has changed little, increasing from 15% of color to 17%. And just under 4% of Fortune 500 CEOs are non-white. With the retirement in 2018 of Ken Chenault as CEO of American Express, and more recently Kenneth Frazier as CEO of Merck, the number of Black Fortune 500 CEOs has decreased to 3. This underrepresentation defies the quickening pace of change in the nation's racial demographics. In 2011, for the first time in America's nearly 250-year history, more babies of color were born than non-Hispanic whites. And since 2010, non-Hispanic whites have been the minority in 22 of the nation's 100 largest metropolitan areas, and it's projected that by 2045, they will no longer constitute a national majority. So I wanted to examine why, despite decades of hand-wringing, costly initiatives, and uneasy conversations, progress in most influential fields has stalled and in some cases is in retreat. Why, after 5 decades of countless studies, high-profile public pledges, and the legions of people of color in the pipeline, many who attended some of the nation's top colleges and universities, is diversity flailing while the business is booming, with billions of dollars annually spent on diversity czars and consultants, training programs, conferences, and climate surveys? And why are the results consistently disappointing? I explore diversity across numerous fields, but pay sustained attention to academia, Hollywood, and corporate America, each of which has publicly and privately grappled with the issue over the past 5 decades. They are among the fields whose leaders have in recent years renewed their commitment to diversity, collectively pledging billions of dollars to commission ever more studies, set up training sessions, and hire consultants and czars to oversee diversity programs. And examining the data and conversing with scores of people on the front line of the movement for change, I discovered some of the reasons why many are still pondering and gesturing rather than meaningfully increasing racial diversity. And while these are complex issues that are not easily boiled down to bullet points, I will nonetheless outline some of the primary factors that contribute to the current diversity landscape and what individuals and institutions might do differently to affect change. Number one, first and foremost, is racial custom, the legacy of racial hierarchies stamped into the American ethos. It's an enduring ideology that permeates mass media, public iconography, so called high art, the Western literary canon, and education curricula from grade school through higher education. And it's important to consider how, until recent decades, the nation's leading colleges and universities, including Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, propagated bigoted theories of racial hierarchies which have not been fully excised from the dominant narrative of America. The extent to which ideas of Black inferiority were stamped into the culture can be clearly glimpsed in a survey of American literature, Hollywood films, and the persisting and demeaning customs like racial profiling and blackface. The dismal numbers reported year after year are a predictable outcome of embedded racial attitudes that define our culture. Much of the unrest we've seen over the past year is a reaction to the ways in which this ethos is expressed in policing, but also in public monuments, in the disparities and the impact of the COVID pandemic, in unemployment and infant mortality statistics, not to speak of the everyday social interactions that we all experience. By now, we've all seen videotape encounters between blacks and whites that resulted in false claims of criminality. We watched a white dog walker weaponize race to falsely accuse a black Central Park dog walker of assault. These everyday encounters can and have led to far graver consequences for black people, as illustrated by the killing of George Floyd. These racial attitudes express themselves in ways large and small. Over the past few years, major fashion houses like Prada and Gucci have apologized for using blackface in their designs. And of course, more recently, we've seen a troubling spike in anti-Asian bias. Along with embedded assumptions about race is a racial illiteracy and an historical amnesia that undermines a true understanding of the roots of persisting bias. Few in this country have the occasion to study the long history of racial injustice and the myriad ways it persists today. Number two, social networks. We live in a rigorously segregated society. People in the academy, in Hollywood, and corporate America, like those in other influential fields, often hire people from their small social and professional networks. People hire who they know. These networks often exclude people of color. For example, at colleges and universities, faculty search committees generally have wide latitude to reach out to anyone they deem suitable or desirable to join the faculty. Hiring, then, is a subjective process, and candidate finalists typically mirror the networks of those leading the search. Searches often result in the hiring of friends and former colleagues or people whose backgrounds, scholarly interests, and sensibilities mirror those of the committee members. The candidates then tend to reflect the overwhelmingly white composition of the faculty. Add to this process of self-referential decision-making the network of influential people who are then asked to write letters of recommendation, which leaves all but a small number of racial minorities out of the loop. For junior level prospective candidates whose scholarship challenges white norms and views embedded in Eurocentric canons, the odds are especially long. Moreover, once institutions do prioritize diversity, many attempt to recruit the same small cadre of proven stars of color in their fields while overlooking emerging people of color in the pipeline. As a result, the same superstars of color are recycled and moved between institutions while the overall number of people of color remains unchanged. The bidding wars over a handful of token stars further stokes resentment among some whites by fueling the perception that racial minorities are the ones benefiting from preferential treatment. This pattern, of course, is not unique to academia. For example, instead of expanding the number of African Americans on corporate boards, many companies recruit the same small number of African Americans who serve on multiple boards. It's a vicious cycle that for decades has helped maintain the status quo. Number 3, failed diversity practices. While many institutions have in recent years hired chief diversity officers and instituted diversity programs, there's a growing body of scholarship that suggests that much of the training mandated by thousands of institutions doesn't work and in some cases does more harm than good. Quote, strategies for controlling bias which drive most diversity efforts have failed spectacularly, close quote. Harvard professor Frank Dobbin and Tel Aviv professor Alev Alexandra concluded in their study, Why Diversity Programs Fail, published in the Harvard Business Review in 2016. Noting the lack of progress in management of Black men since 1985 and white women since 2000, they wrote, quote, it isn't that there aren't enough educated women and minorities out there. Both groups have made huge educational gains over the past 2 generations. The problem is that we can't motivate people by forcing them to get with the program and punishing them if they don't, close quote. Dobbin and Alexandra examined 3 decades of data from 800 U.S. firms and interviewed hundreds of managers and executives. They found that mandatory training, which they describe as command and control approaches, often trigger a backlash, particularly among white men. Rather than being converted, they often react with anger and resistance. But even more troubling is the adverse impact mandatory training appears to have on those it's intended to help. 5 years after instituting training, they found that on average, the number of Black women in management dropped 9.2%, and the number of Asian women and men decreased 5.4 and 4.3% respectively. Another study, Prejudice Reduction, What Works, a review and assessment of research, one of the most comprehensive looks at the efficacy of diversity programs, examined nearly 900 published and unpublished reports of interventions intended to reduce prejudice over a 5-year period. The interventions included workplace diversity initiatives, multicultural education, dialogue groups, media campaigns, and cognitive training intended to combat bias related to a wide range of targets, including race, religion, age, weight, and attitudes towards diversity and multiculturalism. The authors said that entire genres of interventions, including organizational diversity training, advertising, cultural competence, have not been tested. They also found that the positive effects of diversity training at best last a day or two, and even then can trigger backlash. They concluded, quote, one can argue that diversity training workshops succeed because they break down stereotypes and encourage empathy. Alternatively, one can argue that such workshops reinforce stereotypes and elicit reactance among the most prejudiced participants. Neither of these conflicting arguments is backed by the type of evidence that would convince a skeptic. They added that we are, quote, quite far from having an empirically grounded understanding of the conditions under which these programs work best. Close quote. So while there's little evidence that the initiatives most commonly employed work, most institutions continue to go down the same path year after year with little to show for it. So it begs the question, why do they keep doing the same thing yet expect different results? Number 4, the diversity backlash. Following the civil rights movement, America had begun to make tremendous progress towards closing the racial gap in income, education, and really across the board. However, by the end of the 1970s, affirmative action gave way to cries of reverse discrimination, which reverberates still. In 1978, in Bakke versus University of California, the U.S. Supreme Court narrowly ruled in favor of Alan Bakke, a white student who sued the University of California Medical School for reserving 16 out of 100 seats for racial minorities. In a 5-4 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the use of racial quotas in college admissions, saying they violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Writing for the majority, Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell explained, "There's a measure of inequity in forcing innocent persons to bear the burdens of redressing grievances not of their making." Close quote. So the ruling meant that past discrimination of disadvantaged groups could no longer be considered in admission decisions. The Bakke decision was followed in 1981 by the dismantlement of federal anti-discrimination programs under the Reagan administration. Affirmative action continued to be vilified even after quotas were eliminated. By the 1980s, many of the gains, like school integration made during the 1960s and 1970s, were erased, along with federal policies that had begun to address inequality without whites losing ground. As historian Carol Anderson recounts in White Rage, Black unemployment had sharply declined during the 60s and 70s. However, under Reagan, cuts in federal jobs and education programs caused Black unemployment to skyrocket to 15.5%, the highest it had been since the Great Depression. Black youth unemployment rose to 45.7%. Reagan then slashed the training, employment, and labor services budget by 70%, a total of $4 billion, causing college enrollment among African Americans to tumble from 34% to 26%. Thus, Anderson wrote, just at the moment when the post-industrial economy made an undergraduate degree more important than ever, 15,000 fewer African Americans were in college during the early 1980s than had been the case in the mid-1970s. Long after Reagan, the backlash continued. In 1996, after California passed Proposition 209, which abolished affirmative action programs in state hiring, contracting, and college admissions, minority admissions plummeted 61% at UC Berkeley and 36% at UCLA. Similarly, the percentage of Rice University's minority freshman class dropped 36% after Texas eliminated affirmative action programs. One of the people I interviewed was Columbia University President Lee Bollinger, who, while president of the University of Michigan, was named in 2 lawsuits claiming reverse discrimination. He noted how diversity has become an abstract concept due to the Supreme Court's Bakke decision, which prevents universities from seeking remedies for past discrimination when it is precisely the legacy of past discrimination that affirmative action policies attempted to remedy. Quote, "We're deprived of the context that gave it a sense of mission," Bollinger said. Every college leader is told, do not refer to history. I think we have a meaningless, abstract conversation about diversity without a rationale. close quote. In 2019, Mark Perry, an economics professor at the University of Michigan, filed a complaint with the U.S. Office for Civil Rights against Wayne State University for hosting a summer workshop for Black Girls Code, a nonprofit that seeks to address the virtual absence of Black women in the burgeoning tech industry. Many see any attempt to address systemic exclusion as reverse discrimination. And number 5, leadership. Diversity, or the lack thereof, is a leadership issue. While the diversity apparatus, the task forces, studies, officers, conferences, consultants suggest that achieving diversity is rocket science, achieving it primarily requires committed leadership and intention. Instead, many institutional leaders have farmed the problem out to consultants or chief diversity officers who are often marginalized within their institutions. Quote, I think you have to have a civil rights consciousness in order to have this really work, says Bollinger. You have to believe in a principle of justice. Every institution should speak to this. Instead, we've hidden from it. We talk about diversity as if it's detached from this history. I would urge everyone to say it because it needs to be said. I think we've allowed this loss of memory to take hold and the people who oppose it to set the agenda, close quote. So I've spent most of the time explaining why we don't have greater racial diversity. But the good news is that there are successful models that can be replicated. We've never been lacking solutions, only will. In Diversity Inc., I devote a chapter to outlining how the Coca-Cola Company diversified its workforce following a landmark discrimination lawsuit settlement in 2000. Over the course of 5 years and with a system of transparent metrics and accountability, it was able to detect and disrupt patterns of bias that had metastasized in unequal hiring, unequal promotions, salaries, performance evaluations, and bonuses. They began with an audit of employees across race, gender, and job categories, which allowed them to see where people were clustered or underrepresented according to race or gender. In this way, they could detect disparities in pay, promotions, and the like. The company then required managers to account for decisions before they were finalized. So before a hiring decision was made, they'd look at the candidate pool and the kind of outreach that was done. Before salaries were finalized, they'd assess whether there were patterns of bias along racial or gender lines. With vigilance and by holding managers accountable for decisions before they were finalized, they were able to avert instances of bias in real time. By the end of 5 years, the company had managed to hire and promote a far greater number of African Americans, women, and other racial minorities. So rather than attempting to change hearts and minds through canned diversity training sessions, they focused on actual interventions. Among the necessary interventions is outreach to professional networks of color that are often overlooked in the hiring and recruitment process. Another is mentoring to ensure the success of new hires of color. And if diversity is truly an institutional priority, it could be incentivized in the same way that profits and innovations are. And studies show that increased diversity will improve both. But none of these strategies are likely to bear fruit without committed leadership and intention. As Bollinger says, left to its own devices, it won't happen. If there's a silver lining during these challenging times, it is the realization that none of these problems are intractable. When Diversity Inc. was published a little more than a year ago, there were still many who insisted that the nation had overcome race despite the persisting inequities and glaring racial disparities. Since that time, particularly since the killing of George Floyd and the frontal assault on diversity from the Trump White House, there's no longer a need to convince anyone of the urgency of calls for racial justice, with Fortune 500 CEOs declaring that Black Lives Matter. There's few still willing to maintain that our nation is post race. Many are beginning to finally confront the vexed history and legacy of racial bigotry. After years of resistance, practices and policies that perpetuate injustice, including the mass incarceration, criminalization, and police killings of unarmed Black and brown men, are being reassessed. Municipalities are adopting police reforms, some named for Black victims of fatal police encounters. All around us, institutions are heeding protesters' demands for change. An NFL team finally dispensed with a name that had long offended Native Americans. Iconic Black images of servitude like Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben have been removed from products, and Confederate statues and symbols are being retired across the South. Princeton University, after years of defiance, agreed to remove Woodrow Wilson's name from its School of Public Policy. Wilson's racism, the president conceded, was, quote, significant and consequential even by the standards of his own time. He added that Princeton is part of an America that is too often disregarded, ignored, and turned a blind eye to racism, allowing the persistence of systems that discriminate against Black people, close quote. Similarly, the Bronx Zoo has belatedly apologized for exhibiting Ota Benga, a captured young African, in a monkey house cage in 1906. Institutions are beginning to interrogate how racial attitudes and customs have perverted their own ideas related to excellence, merit, hiring, promotions, and institutional priorities. What does excellence look like? Who embodies it? And as they did in the 1960s, some organizations are suddenly hiring and promoting African Americans and other minorities to prominent positions. This sudden change of course is evidence that hardwired racial attitudes can change, and that realizing diversity doesn't require more time or further study. It only requires will, intention, and committed leadership. Thank you for your time. I look forward to engaging your questions.
Dr. Newkirk, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. This is Robert. I'm so looking forward to hopefully having a real iced tea with you in the future as this all covers.
Sounds good.
I love it. I can't wait. It was funny. I was listening to the arc of where you're going, and I'm going, pull up, pull up, pull up. And what a challenge we're facing. I'm glad you ended on a moment of hope. And maybe we could spend a couple minutes just talking a little bit about that. If you were stepping outside of your profession, our profession, you're speaking mostly to the academy here. What's the kick in the butt that you really want to say to us? we educate students. We have the amazing responsibility of what we have to do, yet we're caretakers of knowledge. We're failing.
Well, yeah. Well, that's just it. That's the irony, right? Is that we in the academy are in this unique position to we're educating generations, right? Future generations, and yet we have not yet fully confronted our own complicity in the perpetuation of racial injustice. And, it doesn't start with universities, of course, it starts with like nursery schools, kindergarten. By the time students get to us in the academy, these ideas are so deeply entrenched, right? And so we have an even tougher challenge to try to kind of disentangle and and have students question the assumptions that they've lived with their whole lives. But we can do it. I've seen students in the classroom begin to question their own biases and their own assumptions and their own privilege that they had never really considered. They just unconsciously assume these positions, and it is our job in the academy to, to discomfort people in a sense by making them question all of the ways that injustice is perpetuated, because it cannot happen without individuals contributing to this systemic injustice. Like, yes, there are systems, but we all somehow contribute or combat those systems. And I just think that like I often wonder why more university presidents are not taking the position that Ike Gruber finally took at Princeton. Why aren't university professors at the forefront of the movement for equality, for racial justice, and making sure that we're embedding these ideas into our curricula, into, everything that we do should be about um, ensuring that the ideals of this great nation are actually realized.
Right,
We can do that.
right. So in many ways, you're saying, how do the teachers become the learners before they can become the teachers again?
Right. Yeah.
I was on camp.
But the good news is that you do see more people and more academics, in particular, leaning in and kind of challenging themselves to learn, to enter the void and, and to educate themselves about these things, because I'm often uh, I take note of how many scholars have said, I never knew that. Like, I never looked at that part of history. I never knew that the academy had engaged in slavery, how many of these universities were built by the enslaved. Like, so we need to start interrogating some of these uncomfortable truths, because that only then can we move forward. You can't have, these gaps of knowledge that are serving to contribute to injustice. We can't continue to just ignore that. It's important that we engage.
There's a cluster of questions that deal around examples, leadership, critical race theory, um, case studies, amplifying how can the teachers become the learners who then can become the teachers. Any guidance you might give us from your observations, both from within and from without?
Anytime we start labeling things is when it all falls apart. I think, uh, we as scholars have the duty of educating ourselves around so many clusters of knowledge, right? And when we see that there's a huge area, now we're talking about race, that we haven't confronted in our work, it it behooves us to lean in. We can learn about anything we choose to, or we can continue to say that's too uncomfortable. I don't want to be. If you call it critical race theory, then more people will shy away from it. But if you call it knowledge and enlightenment and how about American history? How about learning the truth about American history, so that you can speak more intelligently about where we are today, because there's a straight line from the past to today. Like, things are not just blowing up out of the thin air. They're happening because of, many things that happen over time, and then it manifests in
Got it.
whatever. George Floyd, mass incarceration, um, you know, widening disparities. These things don't just happen. It's not because people just want to be poor. People just want to be want to live in, impoverished condition. It happens for a reason, and we need all of us to figure out what we can do to make this nation better realize its promise. Our motto is "E pluribus unum," out of many one. Like, do we really believe that? or are they just like beautiful words that we continue to, to turn to, to comfort ourselves about what a great nation this is, but we don't really want to realize those words. And that's what those of us in the academy should want to do, right?
So you talked, I loved your 5 points. You talked about at one end the leadership, because if you follow the leader. The other end, I heard you also talking about things like Rooney's rules. So how do we
Mm,
fill the pipeline? So there's an entry level to
right,
make percents of 5%, 9% go higher. There's a medium level as you go
right.
through an organization, and then there's the leadership, and finally it all wraps up.
Yeah,
Maybe any
because I think there's an assumption that it's just going to happen. Oh, of course, we have
no.
a equal, we're not racist, so why would this happen? It happens because just human nature, right? We're hiring who we know, and if we once we realize that these social networks fan out to become a way of shutting people out, then we have to interrogate those systems and figure out, well, okay, well, we're doing that and it's excluding all of 40% of the population. So how do we then have some intention about the way that we're recruiting and hiring people? You have to bring intention to it. You can't just say, oh, we're race blind. Well, yeah, well, race blindness has caused us to be in this situation where people are systematically pretty much shut out of so many institutions.
That's helpful. In 2015, when I joined Lyrasis, I was coming from San Francisco, and I love all the cultural stereotypes that come from there. I was chatting with a young woman who had just returned from LA back to her hometown. We were both in Atlanta, and it was the start of another bad summer with some things that happened. And she mentioned to me that she said she had just come back from church, and she said the minister talked about peacekeepers and peacemakers. And she talked about peacekeepers as the police, the judges, the system that's in existence now, which sometimes seems insurmountable. But she said it's really important that we keep in mind that we are the peace makers. And that discussion to me was very interesting. And I wonder if there's anything maybe you could maybe bridge that. How do we look at what's happening with police in blue and black? And then how do we look at the things that maybe we can affect and impact every day as humans?
Yeah, because we're all in this, right? It's easy to say, well, it's systemic and I'm not the system. Like, what can I do?
Right.
But we can all do something, right? If I remember right after 9/11, in New York City, there were signs everywhere. If you see something, say something. If you see injustice, like, we all see injustice. We see it's all around us. And how, where are the points of entry for us as individuals? If you're in HR, you can make sure that you're expanding your network of, the professional network of color. You can make sure, like, oh, okay, so we haven't really tapped into networks outside of those that we have historically used. Well, maybe now's the time to start educating yourselves about the networks that you have excluded, in your everyday work. Individuals can do that as well. I often, when I speak to organizations, particularly minority organizations, I tell them, have a list of people ready, of African American engineers, Latino engineers. Like, stop giving people the excuse to say we can't find any because they don't want to do the work to find any themselves. Have that list ready. So there are things that each of us can do to just kind of speed up the process, because, like, I find it kind of disingenuous for organizations, particularly those that are embedded in very diverse cities,
Mm.
when they say things like we can't find any. Like,
Right.
what? like where are you looking? And I always find it interesting that anytime I've been on a search committee, there's like a wealth of talent of color and across the board, and yet, I think it's like one of those knee-jerk things that people just have gotten used to saying because maybe at one time it was true. Maybe 50 years ago there was a pipeline problem. Now the problem is an opportunity problem. It's
I
it's
agree.
it's not the pipeline anymore, whether we're talking about journalism or tech or, you could go down the line. The problem is that people are not on the radar because most institutions use well-worn pipelines to fill their jobs, and they're not doing the work to reach beyond that. And so that's one of the simplest ways. Another thing, I touched on mentoring.
Yes.
Oftentimes, people of color are not sufficiently mentored because there's this awkwardness around race. I've been in workplaces where white HR people or just people who just work at a company have said, I've worked here 4, 5, 6 years and I've never really talked to my African American coworkers. And I'll say, well, why? And they say things like, I don't know what to say. It's like, hello. Like,
Right.
how are you? But that it speaks to a larger issue of discomfort that will stand in the way of mentoring
Mm.
because no one succeeds in any organization without mentoring. You need someone to help you learn the lay of the land and how things operate that are not in the employee manual. Like
I
none of us succeed, right, without some kind of mentoring. So I think that's a inexpensive, highly effective way to ensure the retention of the diversity that you do have, and also it can help you grow diversity by looking to um, college programs, graduate schools where you can mentor. I've seen highly effective pipeline programs, from grad schools to into industries. But mentoring is so key, and it's one of the most overlooked strategies for increasing and retaining diversity.
So I like what you're saying about unlearning certain behaviors and replacing them with better and improved behaviors, things that we can control. There's a series of questions that are, I think, really, uh, the audience one really enjoys your remarks.
Oh,
Uh,
good.
you're welcome. And how do you speak to what people can do tomorrow based on what they've heard today? How does maybe a younger, by stereotype, a person who's just as impatient and can't wait 100 years for change, and maybe somebody who's at the other end of the spectrum going, but you can't rock the boat too much because it's change. How do you talk to the ends if it's the ends of that
Yeah,
type of
it's
conversation?
real. It's like I'm not pretending that this is easy because
Mhm.
it's we're talking about the third rail in American life, right? Race. It's explosive. I mean, it's sad that it is. And I think most of the discomfort around race has so much to do with the lack of experience
Mhm.
across racial lines. It's kind of ironic that the cure for the lack of diversity in many of these institutions is to have more diversity. Because if you have more diversity, then people see, oh, it's kind of like us. Like they're not that different. They're not Martians. They're not the stereotype that I've seen in movies and in rap videos. And these are not the it's not the boogeyman that is so often projected in popular culture. But I think because so many of us don't have experience across racial lines, they they come to these experiences with a lot of baggage, but we can begin to break that down. So that's why I say, instead of institutions focusing so much on training, on getting people accustomed to like feeling good about other people. No, have
Right. Yeah.
interventions, hire more people of color, and people will, they'll work it out.
Right.
Because, and if you put people on teams where they have a goal and they have to accomplish it, guess what? They're going to do their jobs, and you know, I think it's a better, surer way to increase diversity, because if we're waiting for the comfort level to improve when you in these homogenous spaces where they still have no real experience working with people across racial lines, that could take us another 100 years.
We don't have that long. We can't wait that long.
No, I mean, that's what we've been doing though. We've been kicking the can down the road, hoping that something is going to just miraculously change and we're just going to start feeling better about people all of a sudden.
Right.
It's not going to happen all of a sudden, but we can begin interventions like more quickly that will then lead to greater, not just greater diversity, but greater interaction across races. Because a lot of the problem is that we're so segregated. We live in, and many white people have so few occasions to really interact with peers of color, you know. And I don't mean just like the person who mows your lawn or who watches your kid, but a peer, a colleague. And I think diversity in the workplace could be, you know, that laboratory where you begin to work out some of that discomfort through real experience instead of through readings, because it's never going to work. It's not a theory. It's like you have to work with people because you're on the same team and you want to win, right?
Absolutely. Last question. There is a question at the end of the statement. Compare and contrast for me is one of the most effective learning styles. Um, American problem, global problem. What can we learn from Canada? What can we learn from? I ran a company in Israel. Well, the black problem. Well, wait, but don't talk about Palestinians to me. I've been in Turkey. It's like, well, the black problem. Well, but wait, don't talk to me about the Greeks. So we all, I think, in the
It's so true. It's so true. It's a global issue. Like you know, in Italy, they think they don't have a race problem. They think that's an American. That's there. It's the same problem everywhere, because, you know, we're all fed the same propaganda, the same narratives, the same movies, the same, like everything is global now, right? And so and you know, and then when we think of, you know, ideas around race, you know, they were in Europe, they were in India, they were it's, you know, the slave trade was global.
right.
So these ideas are global. But, you know, we're in America, so we're trying to work it out here. We're trying to hold this country to its own words. You know, so, you know, not every country has this idea of liberty and justice for all, but we have the glorious rhetoric that we haven't quite managed to live up to. And you know, we're the experiment that the whole world is watching. If we don't get this right, it's pretty unlikely that anyone else will, or even try.
Dr. Clement Newkirk, that's a phenomenal ending. I think you've inspired us to try and fill the shoes that we have, live in the homes that we're building, fill out the ideals that we've held dear. It's not perfect. I'm not ready to hand in my citizenship. I'm in it for
Exactly.
I'm in
And
it for
nor am I.
yeah,
I'm going to go down fighting.
we're both going to go down fighting. Thank you so much on behalf of Lyrasis. Thank you more importantly for speaking to our community, taking a little bit of time out of your day. I'll free you up. If you can join us for the rest, you're welcome to stay. But thank you so much on behalf of everybody.
Thank
You
you.
want to give her a virtual hand clap for
It's
Dr. Newkirk? This would be
it's been a
wonderful.
pleasure. Thank you. And I'll hold you to that iced tea.
You will. Got it. Thank you very much.